Good morning and welcome to today's ESSER guidance session on broadband and educational connectivity. My name is Wendi Fawns and I'm with the Office of Public Instruction. I am the director of the ESSER program for the state of Montana. And we really appreciate you joining us today to learn more about broadband funding and how school districts and the students that they serve can be benefited by this great resource that we have. Next slide, please. This is my contact information, so you can contact me via phone or via the email link that is placed there. And these slide decks and the recording will also be available on our site. As we go forward today, if you have any questions, you're welcome to put those in the chat. Please understand that there is about a 15-second delay process, so we may not see them right away, but they will then eventually pop up for us to use. Additionally, I do want to point out that later on this week, we are having open office hours. So if there's particular questions with regards to how do I utilize these funds or how can I best mobilize our students and community to get access to these funds, particular to your district, you can set up those times as well. Next slide, please. So to begin with, the goals for this session are to talk about what is broadband or what is internet access. What are the challenges that are facing Montana? And how can ESSER funds help in the solution? And then wrap up, just allow you some additional resources to follow up with. Next slide. So to begin with, broadband is a term that's used for something that is always on. It's an internet connection, and it's the transfer of both data and voice. So it's both of those things. It's providing high-speed access to using multiple technologies. And I put a bold on fiber because that is what the current anchorage or best practices are being anchored on, is the fiber access as the most reliable and highest speed. There is also, however, cable and DSL and satellite and wireless that's available as well. And in some areas of Montana, they may be the only means that is reasonably accessible. The other thing I want to anchor on in terms of the definition is that broadband encompasses sort of unserved, underserved, and those who are served. So simply running a cable in front of your house or in front of the school does not necessarily mean that you are actually served by one of the providers. It does mean that the cabling or the infrastructure or connection point is available, but it doesn't mean that you have access. The current definition of unserved location are those that have 25 megabytes download speed and 3 megabytes upload speed. So that's actually pretty slow, and that is considered an unserved location. The next area is underserved, and those are ones that have 100 megabytes download and 20 upload. Most schools have that, but not all. So again, understanding speed tests, and not just at one point during the day, but getting an average throughout the week or through the day is important in terms of anchoring on the broadband definition of underserved, unserved, and those that are served. This definition of speed and access points comes from the FCC industries, so the providers of technology, broadband access, best practices, and practical use. So it's sort of a combination of all of those together to come up with what are these definitions. Next slide. So in Montana, what's important in terms of this broadband access? During COVID, one of the things, and that's why I have that picture of sort of the old-looking classroom with nobody in it, we might have all gone to remote learning. And during that time, it was important to have broadband access or have reliable access to the internet because most remote learning happened that way. In Montana, just to give you a background, we have about 135 internet service providers, from very small to international providers. Nationally, there are about 2,500, just to give you some perspective. In Montana, we rank 46th regarding internet coverage, speed, and reliability. We're ranked last regarding 1G access, so the ability to have some of those faster speeds. 9 out of 10 residents cannot purchase broadband for what is considered to be a reasonable cost, or $60 a month. And 8 out of 10 residents cannot purchase fiber internet at all. So there's no access to their location, whether it be at home and sometimes even to the school. Again, the challenge for this was during COVID because most of our instruction did occur, at least for a period of time, remotely. Next slide, please. So when we look at ESSER funding for broadband projects, the first thing I want to show you is a slide that indicates, and it's on our website. It's updated every month. So this is a picture as of the end of November that shows where the pockets of ESSER funding currently are. And ESSER 1 has been spent and it's expired. So I just want to show that as that area of funding has been expired. Now we move to ESSER 2 and 3. And those are areas in ESSER that you can actually spend funds on broadband and connectivity remote learning. So those areas are allowable uses of ESSER funding. They have an expiration date. So ESSER 2 has an expiration of 2023. ESSER 3 has an expiration of 2024. However, there are also a significant number of other broadband funding sources, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. Next slide. So before we talk about the funding, I want to again kind of anchor on why that funding is so important, even if you currently have at your school site technology access and you have some of that better served speeds. You have, again, those students who are outside of the school when they go home to do homework, to do after school programs, maybe during the summer, that might not have that speed. And so we're looking at a couple of things in terms of the impact. We're looking at fiber cable, DSL, satellite and wireless, what's available. So some students use, I've talked to students before during the summer where they're using their phones and hotspots to tag in to do work on their laptop. We want to look at the availability and reliability, cost and speed. So you might have availability, you might be able to get connection, but it might not be very reliable. It might in fact be very fast, but it's not reliable. We want to also look at the hardware, operating systems, servers, network technology, routers, modems, and many other things, including what software you're using for your main system access on your laptop. Is it updated? Are there newer security systems that are put in place? And then really looking at viruses and malware is also part of that, because the more you connect into the internet, the more those access points become accessible. Next slide. So the challenges, I think these two slides really sort of demonstrate the I need help, because it is a little overwhelming. So we've got ESSER funding out there that's already available for broadband use, but I'm going to, in a minute, dive into some other sources. Think of this literally as a 4-lane highway road that is coming to a halt in front of a dirt road. We need to balance out feasibility of operational, fiscal, and technology. So just because we have funding available to us doesn't mean that operationally we can get those resources to you. It may also be that technology-wise, there are different solutions that will have to be implemented in different parts of our state. We're a very rural-wide state, and so what works in Billings or Bozeman or Missoula may not work for Glendive and Havre and some of the other locations. In the funding area, we do have ESSER funding, which is based on a head count. So the number of students that were title identified helped to feed into how much ESSER funding each district received. Well, in the same manner, the broadband funding is using a head count with those that are underserved or unserved. So those two numbers within our state will feed into how much money our state is given to provide the solutions. It's important that that number count that is happening right now with broadband is occurring right now through providers. So providers are saying, this is what we see out in our area, service area. We are able to provide this. Now, those individuals that are at those sites may in fact not have access as being identified by the providers. So there is a petition or a challenge process and survey that is on our website that will help you to identify, well, my service provider says they do provide this access to my home, but in fact, I can't get that access to my home. This is the actual speed that I get, and it's very unreliable. So there is a process put in place. It's called a challenge or a petition. And that is something that we are working very hard to ensure that all schools in Montana and all students in Montana have access to that higher speed level that's considered a baseline, that 100 download and 20 upload speeds. The infrastructure, again, we need to look at how the data points are brought forward and how accessible things are. How easy is it to use that? You have great access at, say, a library that's an anchor point for some of these activities, and they have great internet and you can use it, but it's only available Monday through Friday until 4, basically the time of operations that a school would be available. And then the literacy, how familiar are the students and the staff with using internet access? Many students are very familiar with using their phone, but they're not as familiar with using internet access for other activities on a laptop. And so also looking at that security issue, particularly when they're remote in their homes, training along those sides is part of the literacy piece. Next slide. So a couple of the funding that's available, and we're going to start getting in some big numbers here, is that we have the American Rescue Plan Act, which has $266 million estimated was put aside for this particular communication improvement on the network side. And again, you can use ESSER allowable funds, the recently documented FAQs, frequently asked questions, that came out on December 7th. You can look at that also for available funding, and that's available now. So those two pockets of funding, the ESSER funding and the ART plan funding, is available, and schools and other entities are taking advantage of it. It is funds that are currently being provided to the communication providers or the broadband providers to help build up that infrastructure, those cables, those connecting points. Think of it again as that 4-lane highway coming to your school or coming to the home. When we look at the FCC Emergency Connectivity Fund, that is something that's also available to help with connectivity, laptops, hotspots, and modems. So some of the schools and libraries were using those funds. They're also still available. I don't have a number on that. It was very individualized by what libraries in particular in Montana were using that. And then there is the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act. So that is the one that right now is in the mode of being identified as to how much funding will come into our state. And that's where it's very important that we identify the real access points. What is the speed and what is the reliability at each of those access points? Because that helps to determine how much money our state will have. That Infrastructure Investment and Job Act has been broken into several different pieces. There's a BEAD funding that is looking at about $308 million to help provide connectivity to our state. Another area I really want to mention that isn't being utilized much right now is the Affordable Connectivity Program. And that's something also that's available right now. It provides subsidies to eligible students and families for $30 a month to $75 a month. And so right now, families can actually get some assistance with the cost side of internet. Now, I realize that doesn't help very much if they simply don't have internet access or can't get internet access under their current settings. But those students and families that do have access may be able to get a subsidy to allow that on an ongoing basis to help with connectivity. Think of that in much the same way as years ago when the telephones were rolled out into the United States. There were rural entities where lines were brought out and phones were brought in, and that group had lifeline discounts that were given to them. The last pocket of funding we have is the National Tribal Broadband Grant, and that's estimated right now to be about $127 million. So that is available for tribal communities and specific to the reservation areas and students. So one of the things you can see from all of these funding sources is there's a lot of funding. How those funds are used is very important. ESSER funding, while it allows for broadband and technology upgrades and support, it is more flexible than the other pockets, than the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act or the Affordable Connectivity Program, because the second two, the Affordable Connectivity Program and the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act, those two are specific to broadband, whereas ESSER you can use for broadband. And we recommend that districts braid funding together. So, and I use the funds that are most restrictive first and to target, and then the least restrictive, use those secondarily for particular topics like broadband. And again, I know that's a little bit confusing and maybe too high a level, but feel free to reach out to us for further information. Next slide, please. So to help with identifying, remember I was saying the Infrastructure Investment Job Act, the BEAD funding is really determined by who is identified right now as unserved and underserved, those two pockets. So I do apologize. So those two pockets are available to you to look into and run this speed test, and identifying the speed test and where you anchor will help put you into either the underserved or unserved pockets. And that will help identify how much money our state gets, and therefore whether or not we're able to provide service to everyone throughout the state, which is the goal. So all you really need to do at this point is to run a very simple speed test. You do go into a link, you press, I want to take the speed test, and then you can run it multiple times if you want to get an average, or you want to do 2 or 3 in a day, and then you can upload those numbers to the portal access. And it just has a slot and it says what's your upload speed and what's your download speed. It says both of those clearly on there. We do ask you as school districts, if you're able to engage your community in this. This is a wonderful thing to like mention at the school boards, or maybe send out a news flash on Facebook, any of those mechanisms. It really helps to get the community involved in this process. At a recent meeting that I was at, both in Butte and Missoula, several of the people who came and participated indicated that their service providers said they had access at a certain speed to their homes, and yet they didn't feel that they had that access. So this is an opportunity for you to get real data from your house and be able to provide that in a better, more accurate data capture. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, where do we want to go with broadband in the next 2 years? That's part of what we're trying to gather, is to gather a picture of where our state is right now with broadband, so that we can capture as much of this funding as we can to be able to provide better access throughout our state. What are the challenges that we're encountering? Again, it falls into that infrastructure, into the technology, the operation and literacy part as well, and of course the access. And looking at, do we have IT personnel to help with the technical challenge that this is going to provide? We want to know the answers to those and start working on those before we end up with that 4-lane highway that hits currently perhaps at a dirt road, that 4-lane highway turning into a full 4-lane highway, no dirt road, but there's no one to manage it. So we do want to kind of look at that whole platform altogether and how we can best manage the broadband funding for the long haul. Next slide, please. If you have any questions, again, you can see our website. We have a broadband button, and you can also contact Rebecca Brown, our program manager, or Wendi Fawns, our director, for more information. If there are any questions, you can put them into the chat session. We are hosting, if we go back to the, thank you for that reminder, we are hosting office hours later today, as I mentioned, and that information is available here as well if you have any particulars about your district.